forums focusing on some of this month's key races. Today, we're taking a look at the position 3 judge of the Oregon Court of Appeals race. 2 candidates are vying for election. I'm sorry to say that the challenger of Vance Day declined our invitation, but we're very glad to have the incumbent Judge Ortega with us today. In a moment, we'll hear from Judge Ortega, but first I wanted to say that the goal of these forums is to help voters learn more about candidates who, if elected, will be important players in our criminal, legal, and punishment systems. You can view the Oregon Justice Resource Center's previous 2 forums, the Washington County District Attorney race and the Portland City Commissioner's race, on our website. Visit ojrc.info/elections for more information. For a little background, the Oregon Court of Appeals, which is comprised of 13 judges, I believe, Judge Ortega will correct me if I'm wrong in a second, is the first level of appeal following trial. The court has jurisdiction to hear all civil and criminal appeals from circuit courts, except death penalty cases, and to review most state administrative agency actions. Decisions made at the Court of Appeals, at the Oregon Court of Appeals, can have important and profound impact on the lives of ordinary Oregonians, especially decisions on policing and criminal justice. Judges on the Oregon Court of Appeals bring various professional and life experiences to the job, which is why it's important for voters to ask searching questions of the candidates and try to understand their approach to important legal issues if they win. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are the Oregon Justice Resource Center. We are a nonprofit law firm founded in 2011 that provides free legal services to Oregonians, specifically people in prison and people whose civil rights have been violated. We have 6 programs operating under one roof and sharing administrative costs so they can put more resources into serving clients. You can learn more about us at our website, ojrc.info. As a 501c3, OJRC does not endorse candidates for election. Members of our staff have sometimes, including in this election cycle, endorsed candidates in their personal capacity. As the person moderating this conversation, I can say I have not and will not endorse in this position 3 judge of the Oregon Court of Appeals race. As attorneys who work across many different aspects of the criminal legal system and the prison system, we have plenty of questions for our own for Oregon Court of Appeals candidates. We also want to make this an event where you can get your questions answered. So if you're in the webinar with us on Zoom, you can send your questions to us. Alternatively, if you're watching on YouTube, you can also add your questions there. I would encourage you to stick to questions rather than statements, and to keep your questions as straightforward as you can so we can get through as many as possible. So with that, let's begin. I want to welcome Judge Darlene Ortega, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. How are you doing, Judge Ortega?
I'm doing all right. I have a longer answer, but I'll save it. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. We're really glad you're here today. And so just to help out anyone who's not familiar with you yet, can you just give us a little bit about your professional background and experience, kind of who you are, why you're running for this position?
Yeah. So I have been on the Court of Appeals since 2003. Before that, I practiced in the civil arena for 14 years. My personal background is I come from a family that lived kind of on the edge of poverty, mixed race family. I have a mother who's Mexican-American and a father who's Anglo, and I have 3 siblings, 2 of whom are adopted African-American men. My household that I grew up in was very troubled. I experienced family violence and racism, and all of those experiences were very formative for me. I entered the judiciary without any real experience practicing in the criminal arena. I had some practice working in the juvenile dependency arena, which is a concern of mine. And then I had my own experiences with family violence that kind of influenced my interest. I think in my time on the bench, my sort of trust in the ability or current ability of the legal system to contribute positively to many of those problems has in many ways declined. I see more the way in which the system fails litigants and that we need to do better. And that's a very important part of the way I approach the work, and why I want to continue in that position, because I think the time I've spent on the court has helped me to see work we can do to improve the way we approach the legal problems that come before us, and be better equipped to not cause harm and hopefully make things better. I think oftentimes the legal system causes harm.
And I know I kind of gave a brief introduction to the Oregon Court of Appeals in my intro, but in your words, kind of, can you help us understand what the Oregon Court of Appeals does?
Yeah, thank you for that question too. I have a concern about how little people understand it, which I kind of lay at the feet of the judiciary, because I don't think we talk about what we do enough. And as you said, we take actions that have a lot of impact on real people. As you said, the Court of Appeals hears appeals of all the cases that come through the trial courts, and most of the kinds of issues that come through agencies, with the exception of death penalty, as you said. So that's a huge variety of cases. And in each of those cases, somebody has lost and they have a right to appeal to us. We review those cases on a cold record, so we don't have witnesses giving testimony in our courtroom. Somebody else has already decided the case, so there's a fair amount of momentum that comes with a case that's come to us, that somebody already won, and we have to decide that what happened in the trial court or in the agency was in error. And we do that in groups of 3 judges mostly, although there are some situations where all 13 judges, you were accurate on that, would weigh in on an issue. And most cases stop at the Court of Appeals. People have the right to petition to the state Supreme Court if they don't like a ruling that we've made, and somebody always doesn't like a ruling we've made, but they accept only very few cases. So most cases reach their final decision in the court that I sit on.
Well, thank you for the explanation. I think that is an important piece that a lot of people don't understand, is that you got to ask permission essentially to get your case to the next level, which doesn't happen often. So. And so in 2020, as you probably know, we had a national racial justice movement that made us kind of confront our history of racial injustice and structural racism. Since then, we have seen some pushback, or a lot of pushback, on this conversation and movement, not unlike the pushback that we witnessed to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Can you maybe help us understand how this has affected the Court of Appeals, and have you participated in any conversations among the judiciary about this?
Yeah, the events of 2020 were, in a peculiar way, raising to the fore issues that have existed for a long time, and people reacted as though the murder of George Floyd was just the end point. Like, this is enough. We're not going to tolerate this anymore, which to a lot of us who have been concerned about racial justice and racial injustice for a long time, it was somewhat frustrating, because it's like, okay, we'll take this, but this is not new. And this person who had a terrible police encounter is not like, it was a terrible thing that happened, but it's not like that's never happened before. And a lot of institutions issued statements. I was among those who found that somewhat frustrating, because a statement doesn't mean anything unless it reflects an ongoing commitment to really address the forces that lead to so many bad results, terrible acts of violence, and terrible statistical signs that a lot of injustice is happening. A real commitment to addressing those things. And, it would be hard to find many organizations that were already engaged in that work. There was some of that happening in the court system too. I found that frustrating as someone who's been trying to raise those issues my entire career, with a lot of pushback. But I responded by taking the opening that was there and doing what I could, which is limited because people don't just do what I tell them to do, but doing what I could to use that opening to open us to have conversations that I think we should have been having before now. But since we all care about racial justice now, let's start having these conversations about the forces that are contributing to these terrible realities in our society. So on my court, what we ended up doing was setting up a monthly conversation among the judges to educate ourselves about the experiences of different communities, specifically the Black community, the Indigenous community, people who have been incarcerated and spent time in prisons and jails, various pockets of inequity, and there are many that exist in the communities that we serve, out of a recognition that we don't know very much about that. And the way the job of a judge is constructed doesn't require us to know. We just sort of tend to function as though a case comes to us, the lawyers are going to talk to us about it, everything that we need will be there, and we come equipped just because we're judges with everything we need to know to discern what's happening in the case and reach a result. And that's just not accurate. I think I am one of the few people of color who serves as a judge in Oregon. And I am also one of the even fewer people who has spent a long, long time engaging with these issues. And all of those realities don't equip me with everything I need to know in every case. There are plenty of people who come before me who are having experiences that I am not having and have not had. So without spending that time educating myself about the experiences of those communities, I won't have what I need to do my job well, which is to apply the law to the facts, but with enough curiosity to wonder, like, who is talking to me? What context are they speaking from? What questions do I need to ask to hold the party with the burden of proof, which in so many cases is the state, hold that party to that burden of proof? That takes educating ourselves. So what I've done is try to expand the conversations that we're having so that outside of the cases that are in front of us, we equip ourselves with better awareness about what people are experiencing. There's so many reasons how in a particular case, what's really going on won't make it into the record. There's things like the rules of evidence, and there's also things like power dynamics in the system itself that, for example, mean that a criminal defendant may not testify because the way the system plays out, it's against their interest to do so, but then they're sitting there in the courtroom watching everybody talk about something that they are alleged to have participated in and their voice is not heard. So because that's how records get made, we need to be awake enough to question it in the ways it needs to be questioned. So that's how, it was a long answer, but that's how I've approached the window. I would view it as a window that was opened in 2020 to help us. Okay, we care about this. Well, what does caring about this look like? And that's not the only way, but one important way that I think I've been able to assist us in moving things in a better direction. As it happened, I had already been hosting conversations for all the court staff around that weekly. Those aren't very well attended, but I've persisted in doing it because I will talk to one other person. I will talk to 2 other people. I will talk to 100 other people. Any space I can open where we're engaging these issues of racial injustice and other communities that so often go unheard, I'm going to make those kind of spaces and hold them and practice myself struggling with those questions. It's not like I have all the answers. I just know how to practice.
Yeah, and I think it's really important too, being bound by the record, where if if the trial court doesn't necessarily take notice of something, or if something doesn't come out in the record, regarding either racial injustice or certain circumstances, it's hard, I think, I would assume, for the court of Appeals to kind of reckon with that and to really try to dig in there, because it's not necessarily something that you can do.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't disagree with that. I'm not suggesting that we can go out and do our own investigation or collect more testimony. We can't. But that doesn't mean we just accept what everyone tells us as, oh, that's true. I mean, our job is to ask questions about that. And our job is to make assessments of who has the burden of proof, which is generally already set in the law, and did they meet it? And there is quite a bit of judgment involved in those sorts of decisions. And we will exercise that judgment with more integrity if we're awake to the kinds of things that influence how a record gets made. So I think we have more ability to impact how a case gets decided than we sometimes act like we do. There's a kind of a phrase that gets used about judges that we just call balls and strikes. And even in calling balls and strikes is not as rote as that, but definitely judging isn't. There's a lot of judgment calls that go into it that involve some discretion and discernment. And I want mine and ours to be better informed than it has been historically.
Absolutely. And I think that goes to, you kind of answered a question that I did have, which is, Brian Stevenson talks about the importance of getting proximate to issues, and that, it's necessary for us to be close to the people impacted by the system. And I think you talked a little bit about that. And as a prisoner rights organization, we're always working to improve conditions for those who are incarcerated and trying to change the narrative about our community members who are incarcerated. And one of the things that I think connects here and is surprising to us is that we're consistently confronted with that stakeholders haven't necessarily visited a prison. And so I guess my question for you is, have you visited a prison? And if so, what do you gain from it?
I have visited various prisons in our state a number of times, and I would do that again anytime I had the opportunity. Judges will typically visit a prison when they first become a judge if they participate in the general kind of orientation program that we have for judges. And I did that too, but I will say that wasn't nearly enough, because that was a group of judges coming in, and the Department of Corrections is talking to us, giving us like a special tour, and I think that's useful, but it's not, I don't think it's useful to do that one time. I think there are other contexts for engaging with people who are incarcerated that have been more useful to me, where I actually can engage those folks in conversation and listen to their stories, which did not happen when I did kind of the DOC arranged visit. So I have taken many opportunities to go in and engage inside the prison with incarcerated folks at Coffee Creek and OSP and the other prison in Salem, which initials I'm now double crunching. Yes. OSCI and McLaren and the other, I think it's called Hill Creek or whatever, the other juvenile facility in Salem that I think is now somewhat reduced. And then also to talk with formerly incarcerated folks about their experiences. I wouldn't say that I have learned everything I need to know now from doing that. In fact, most times I've had the opportunity to engage with people who've had those experiences, or with their families too. I learn things I didn't know, and I often think it's so heartbreaking to me that I'm spending so much of my time deciding issues that affect this population when really this job is not set up to require me to know anything about it. It just isn't. I mean, other than that one visit, we're not required to know any of that. The whole structure of the system sort of treats us like we just know a whole bunch of stuff we don't know. And I've been saying for a while that what passes for neutrality among judges too often is less neutral and more just ignorant. And I don't mean to insult anyone by saying that. I am a judge though, so I'm speaking of myself. Like, I think the system assumes we know far more than we do. And yet our job, I think properly understood, requires us to be curious about the cases that come before us. And I think we're going to be more curious if we're kind of unsettled about what could be happening, what likely is happening right under our noses that nobody's talking about. And even though I can't go out and get evidence and put that evidence in, there is somebody in every case who has the burden of proof. And when we're talking about criminal matters, it's usually the state. When we're talking about juvenile dependency matters, it's usually the state. In so many cases, it's the state. But I think the people in any given situation, the people with power have a much easier time telling their version of a story than those without power do. And one of the reasons for that is because judges have power. And we believe people that have power. I mean, I think that's just human. It's not like personal evil. It's just kind of the structure of the system. So the more unsettled I am, appropriately so, about how these things are playing out in life, the more likely it is that I will operate from very appropriate curiosity about the cases that come before me, and also some humility about how my social location limits my view and might tend to make me comfortable with things I ought not to be comfortable with. And I would say after 18 years on the bench, I'm less comfortable than when I arrived. I wouldn't say that's typical of every judge, but in my case, having approached the job from a very intentional listening posture, I think it's appropriate that I'm less comfortable. I think it's my job to stay uncomfortable so that I do this job with any sort of integrity.
Yeah, I love there's always more to learn. As a formerly incarcerated person myself, I can't tell you everything about being incarcerated. I talk to other people who are formerly incarcerated, and they have different experiences and more recent experiences. So I love that. There's always more to learn.
Well, and I think you hit on something important there too. I think we tend to think like if we talked to one person, now I understand everything about. Okay, so I talked to one incarcerated person, now I know everything about that. Or I talked to one Black person, I know everything about Black experience. And, nobody has been elected by any constituency to speak for that constituency. I don't speak for all Latinas or Chicanas, I speak for my experience. I think my experience has the potential to be very useful to helping me listen better, but it doesn't tell me everything I need to know. So I need to continue that work of, I think, as Stevenson rightly points out, putting myself in proximity to members of the community who have things to teach me that I need to know. And there's no one for whom that's more true than the people who have the hardest time being heard, the people who suffer the most inside this system. So I do imagine a future world in which judges will be required to account to the public. What are you doing to put yourself in a position in an ongoing way to learn from the most marginalized people in this culture so that you can do that job well?
Absolutely, which ties in perfectly to my next kind of question, which is, one of the communities that often gets ignored almost completely a lot of times, although you did mention this population previously, but in conversations about civil rights and criminal justice is the Native or Indigenous population. And so I don't know if you saw recently, a new report was released by the federal government, which documents the horrors of boarding schools and the efforts that occurred to really remove and decimate the Native population. And as you know, Oregon is home to many tribes and a large Native population. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done as a judge to better educate yourself about the community, the Native and Indigenous community?
Yes, that's been an area of real concern for me. And as with some of the other subjects we've mentioned, that concern has grown as I've educated myself. To be surrounded by tribes and Indigenous communities, and to have grown up in this state and arrived in, my 50s with so little information about the experience of those folks, I think is very typical and also quite alarming. I have been part of what's called the Tribal Court State Court Forum. It's now been expanded into a tribal court, state court, federal court forum that's meant to improve communication between the tribal courts in our state and the state courts and now the federal courts. And that's been an interesting gathering to be part of, because we meet once or twice a year with tribal court judges. And at time, it's been common in our meetings that we'll start talking about how we're going to solve something, and we don't prioritize enough listening to the tribal voices. And so I'm generally the person in the room is like, well, let's let the tribes tell us what the issues are in terms of the relationship between those courts and the other courts in the states. And we've come up with a lot of issues where their orders are not being respected, or they see issues with how ICWA is playing out, or how other things are happening in the relationship between the tribes and the state that we just haven't seen. So that's been useful. I have had several opportunities to engage with folks that Red Lodge is working with. So those are services for incarcerated members of the Native community, and also those who are formerly incarcerated. I've done quite a bit of personal reading on that subject that has fueled a lot of interest, particularly around the boarding schools. And I've led some discussions at the court around those subjects. I'm not really in a position to lead that conversation, but it's more like creating materials for us to wrestle with. We brought in Bill Johnson, who's the chief judge of the Umatilla tribes, because he had recommended a book about some of their tribal history that is very impactful to this day, as one would learn to expect if you educate yourself. And so we all read this book that he recommended, and he came and spoke with us. So I think there's so much more that we could do. I recently had a very good conversation with NAYA about how we can collaborate better to listen to the tribes about, marginalized communities usually can give you a long list of neglected issues, but they don't get asked very often in a way that really invites an answer. So I think there's lots more we could do to create spaces for those sorts of conversation and make them real. I can only assume the list is endless for the amount of repair that needs to happen. I know there's a lot of issues perking up in the area of ICWA. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now that I've led some discussions about at the court around that too, that really challenge tribal sovereignty. And so that's just an area of real interest for me.
Well, I appreciate you sharing on that. I think it is, again, goes to kind of the always learning, even when that learning maybe becomes or makes you maybe even more uncomfortable with the issue. And just to be respectful of time, I know we, even with the late start, we are at 30 minutes, and so we're unfortunately not going to get to any other questions. But I did want to thank you, Judge Ortega, for joining us this afternoon. Once again, we're sorry that Canada Advance Day declined to join us, and to answer some questions. The primary is fast approaching, and so just for any listeners out there, we want to make sure that you turn in your ballot, research the candidates, and reflect on them, and make sure you do vote in the race, because your decision has a huge impact on Oregonians, especially those who are impacted by the legal and punishment systems of our state. And I also just wanted to thank, I think his name is Jarvis, our ASL interpreter. And special thanks to everyone who did submit questions, although we're not going to be able to get to them. And then you can watch this recording again on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and we'll put the link on our social media. And then this is our last of the candidate forums this month. You can find past events, which are the Washington County DA race and the Portland City Commissioner #3 race on YouTube. And once again, Judge Ortega, thank you so much for joining us.